Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today, What Works and What Doesn't? A discussion on water quality training. My name's Vicki Burns, and I'm the, excuse me for my little frog in my throat. I'm the chair of the Manitoba Eco Network Board, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The water that we drink comes from Shoal Lake First Nation, and the hydropower we enjoy comes at the expense of many First Nations in northern and rural Manitoba. We are connected through the inherent responsibility to respect water bodies, tributaries, and the spirit of the Lake Winnipeg watershed. Our organizations are committed to systemic change, to respect for the treaties and all Indigenous nations, and to real reconciliation. And I would just like to put it out there that if any of you would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territories that you are joining from, you could either do that just to yourselves or put it in the chat. And now I would like to, first of all, let you know that each speaker is going to talk for just 14 minutes. A reminder to the speakers, we need to be really paying attention to our time today. And please reserve your questions for after all the speakers have finished. And we actually do have half an hour set aside for questions and answers if we need it. So put your questions in the chat. And now I would like to introduce Marina Putsirova. Marina is a policy advisor for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Marina works on policy solutions for successful freshwater management, particularly in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. She's worked extensively in public policy research with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where she interpreted government policies and analyzed data, delivering recommendations for government. She's also assisted on many projects in partnership with such organizations such as the Southern First Nations Network of Care and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And she holds master's degrees in economics from the University of Manitoba and Moscow. So welcome, Marina, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, I'm pleased to be here today, and I'm pleased to share some of the key concepts around water quality trading and drivers and barriers to a successful water quality trading program implementation. And I will also provide a little bit of policy context from Manitoba with regards to water quality trading. So water quality trading is a policy instrument that allows to improve water quality in the watershed. And this model has been tried in many watersheds and with a certain variation of program setups that worked with those particular watersheds. And we are going to explore some of those program elements, and the insights for this presentation are based on the review of the case studies that ISD conducted in 2019. Okay, so those are the contents for this presentation. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is water quality trading. And then next, we're going to look at the illustrative example of a program setup. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some institutional elements that are important for setting up a water quality trading program. Those are prerequisites for generating supply and demand for water quality credits and some other key considerations. I'm going to talk a bit about Manitoba policy context and finish up with some further resources and some concluding remarks. So what is water quality trading? So first of all, water quality trading program treats watershed as a unit, and it's an instrument that can incentivize polluters in the watershed to keep emissions in the watershed at a certain level, so within a certain cap that has been set by regulation. And this is done by trading water quality credits, that is water quality improvements in the watershed. So if one entity in the watershed reduces their emissions below a certain baseline, so they can sell those water quality improvements to another entity for whom it is more costly to achieve the equivalent water quality improvements. So on the overall, on the watershed level, the pollution reductions are achieved in cost-effective ways. So basically that's the concept, and trading and offsetting are often used interchangeably. So who's trading? There are point sources and non-point sources. Point sources such as wastewater facilities. Non-point sources are more diffused over the landscape, and those could be agriculture. And there are combination and different programs there, for example, point source to point source trading. There could be point source to non-point source trading, which is quite widespread. And what is being traded? Their nutrients, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus. There's some other things that could be traded, for example, temperature, although less common. And it's important to note that a credit that's being traded is a verified unit of pollution reduction. And for example, those could be kilograms of phosphorus per year. And Manitoba, as we know, eutrophication, phosphorus enrichment is is a problem. So phosphorus trading would be something of interest. So this is an image illustrating graphically how this water quality trading can work. So demand side represented by point sources, and supply side is represented by non-point sources. So the point sources are purchasing credits from a centralized credit exchange, and then the supply side of credits are coming from the farmers or agriculture. This could be best management practices and that are installed in the land. And along with those best management practices that generate the credits, there are additional ecological benefits. For example, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration. Those practices could be, for example, repairing buffers. And it's also important to note that there are relationships that are built when the water quality program is set up, relationships between point sources, non-point sources, farming community, also program administrators and verifiers, different organizations. And there are a couple of prerequisites that are necessary to generate supply and demand in water quality trading. First of all, there needs to be regulations. So point sources need to have enforced regulatory limits to meet, and those need to be framed in terms of loads and not concentration. So in the United States, they have total maximum daily loads for pollutants. So they identify all point source and non-point source pollutants within the watershed and allocate the loads. And second, there needs to be significant variation in pollution abatement costs. And significant is an important word here because the program setups are complex and there are a lot of upfront investments to develop a program. There are also transaction costs borne by program administrators to connect buyers and sellers. Those transaction costs are often incorporated into the credit price. So those things need to be considered. So there needs to be a significant variation pollution abatement costs between different trading partners. If there isn't, if this kind of prerequisite are not met, the water quality trading can take a bit of different form. It could be that, for example, corporations buy water quality trading credits as part of their corporate sustainability goals. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit about other key considerations in water quality trading programs. So a very important concept is to ensure equivalency of pollutant reductions in the watershed. So for example, we are trading pollution reductions achieved by different entities in the watershed. So we want to make sure that for example, reductions at the source, like for example, the buyer, that the buyer is required to reduce pollution to a certain level, and what it purchased from somewhere else is equivalent. So, for example, non-point sources are diffused over a large area, and their pollution is highly variable. So, there are modeling that could be done to understand what are the pollution reductions from, for example, best management practices. And the models have been developed to measure that. So that also requires, of course, upfront investments to develop. And trading ratio is another concept that's very important, and it ensures equivalency of pollution reductions across watershed. And trading ratio is sort of a multiplier that is applied to the trades. So if, for example, you have a trading ratio of 4:1, this means that the buyer, for example, point source needs to offset a certain amount of, for example, phosphorus it emits, right? So they would purchase 4 times the amount of reduction from somewhere else. So that's the trading ratio, 4:1. And the trading ratios could be different, and there could be different considerations put into developing a trading ratio. Okay, next we have another important consideration, and it's when we talk about the program that involves non-point sources such as farming community and landowners, there needs to be adequate time commitments and resources for program planning and implementation. So we need to engage farmers early in the design phase of the project and involve an organization with a strong institutional presence working with the farmers and reduce onerous paperwork for farmers. Another consideration in a water quality trading program setup is transaction costs, and we have touched on this briefly already. So the cost of developing program rules such as research, policy development are substantial, and there are also costs in the program running of the program. There could be a modeling, verification, monitoring, or certification of credits to make sure the credits are valid. And those costs are usually incorporated in the credit price. So there needs to be kind of a careful balance of these different elements to determine the program scale, and it's always recommended to keep things simple for these types of programs. And so all of these parameters are important, and although there are larger programs, sometimes more local programs are more effective, and maybe it could explain that sometimes these programs are more difficult to scale up. A little bit of water quality trading context for Manitoba. And Manitoba's Climate and Green Plan, Manitoba government mentioned that it considers water quality trading as an innovative approach to improve nutrient reduction while supporting economic development. And the credits, for example, could be purchased from landowners who are willing to hold nutrient on the lands through programs like Growing Outcomes on the Watershed, GROW program. And also water quality trading depends on establishing nutrient targets. In this context, Manitoba recently consulted on the development of proposed nutrient targets for Lake Winnipeg and its tributaries under its Water Protection Act for nutrient reduction. So as you can see, there is some interest, and yeah, this proves our discussion is quite timely. Okay, so what can we conclude from this kind of introduction, water quality trading, and some of the main elements? To summarize, there are some factors that need to be taken into consideration, and it's essentially a case-by-case solution that needs to be tailored very much to a situation in the watershed and the stakeholders there. And there needs to be, of course, a champion to move a program forward and build relationships. There also needs to be developed an enforced regulation on polluters to generate demand for credits, and those are load-based nutrient limits for large facilities. And as we also talked about, there needs to be significantly differential abatement costs among those different entities in the watershed to enable the trades. And also it's important to kind of balance the science and stakeholder buy-in regarding a trading ratio, and overall simplicity and low transaction costs are key to successful implementation of a water quality trading program. Okay, so there are things that we didn't cover yet, but I suggest looking into this report that we've done earlier, and we examined 6 programs from Canada, the United States, and New Zealand, and it covers more on how these programs worked and what was different about each of those, and what were the enablers and what were the barriers. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to learning as well from others about their experiences with water quality trading. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marina. That's important information, and thank you for the references. And just remind everybody that we do have a good amount of time at the end of all the speakers for question and answer, so please write your questions in the chat and we'll keep track of them. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Daniel Gladu-Canoe. He's the director of the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective, which is the Indigenous voice for Lake Winnipeg that protects and preserves the lands and waters of our nations to restoring the health of the sacred lake for future generations. He's of Anishinaabe, Irish, and Métis descent from Treaty 3 territory in eastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. So welcome, Daniel, and I'll hand it over to you now.
All right, thanks, Vicky. And thank you, Marina, as well for your presentation. I'll just share my screen here. Yeah, today I wanted to talk about water quality trading, of course, with everyone, and try and bring a bit of a lens on how we see this from the perspective of the Indigenous collective. So collective work of Watershed that either excluded First Nations or I see that I'm unstable. Can I be heard? Am I being heard? Yeah. Okay. Either excluded First Nations and Indigenous peoples or only involved people in a kind of tokenistic way. So the idea was to come together to start to have conversations about what we as First Nations see as important for the lake, and then seek partnerships and solutions to address those. So we're here to talk about water quality trading, and I guess I wanted to maybe mirror a little bit of what Marina said about the basic setup of water quality trading. So in some ways, I can see the what's interesting or how it could be useful in terms of seeking a balance between what's the most cost-effective way to reduce pollution, and then transferring sort of the reward, the credits to those that are mitigating and restoring those areas. And I want to recognize too that like it is part of a toolbox of part of one tool in a toolbox. So it can complement other water quality policies, and I think importantly that water quality policies do have to be robust for it to actually work. So some of the challenges I'm curious about is, one is that it doesn't really replace bad environmental policy. So if you have a regulatory environment that doesn't support good water quality, then a water quality trading market could emphasize those problems and further cause problems. You need access to good data. We always argue that incorporating and working with Indigenous people and involving Indigenous knowledge holders in decision making is critical. You need to have a good understanding of what the management practices are for the region. So if you simply apply BMPs that are ineffective, it can skew what we understand to be working or not. And of course, that means that a good market will have to have accountability, transparency, and maybe one sort of pet peeve of mine. I wanted to bring up this idea of non-point sources, which I really view as something as a problem with granularity, where what we're really talking about is just the inability to have monitored that source. And I know we're talking about something that's spread over an area that is more diffuse, as it were, but it's also clear that there are people who are responsible for managing those areas and therefore the pollution that comes from it. And then lastly, and what I'm going to focus on for most of my conversation is environmental racism. So, well, let's just get into it. So environmental racism, this is for those who haven't heard this concept before, is really just any of the sort of policies, decisions, directives, practices that exist that on the environment that will affect Indigenous people, people of color, racialized communities. And this doesn't have to be intentional. Often this can be done unintentionally or sort of in ignorance, as well as intentionally. So you can see a picture here of the Grand Rapids hydroelectric dam. This amongst many of the dams set up in Manitoba have been done in a sense to First Nations people and Métis people. Very little consultation. And in fact, really no consultation was done for most of the dams that was set up until more recently, often displacing people, displacing their ways of life, and harming really generations of people. This was something that was done to people and really is a burden that's borne by First Nations peoples. I always have to talk from the Dryden Chemical Company. So it was between 1962 and 1970, the Dryden Chemical Company, which is a part of a paper mill there, dumped about 10 tons of methyl mercury into the river there. Downstream, people in Grass Narrows were hugely affected. So for methyl mercury is something that really attacks the nervous system, causing tremors and all kinds of problems, including paralysis and death. And concerningly too, birth defects. And so it's become a long generational problem that while there was estimates that there would be recovery after 50 to 70 years in the environment, those effects are still being felt to this day. And really it's only recently that it's been acknowledged that this was done. And I think it's important to remember that this wasn't an accident. This was a decision. And when we think of market-based solutions like water quality trading and environmental racism, they have the opportunity to really emphasize some of the inherent racism in our systems. People who may not have access to decision makers and are sort of seats of power are disproportionately affected by the outcomes of both policy and development. And so water quality trading and cap and trade systems have been shown to have an impact on both the health and kind of environmental quality around low income and minority communities. Often these programs can also fail to really bring in racialized communities, both so that they won't see the benefits of the trading, but also aren't able to participate in the decision making about where water quality can be reduced and degraded. And then maybe worse, and then on top of that, just the failure to really recognize that there is a problem at all. I came across some research that was looking at environmental justice in the U.S. and they did an interview and asked people about environmental justice and inequities, and what they came back with was, well, there wasn't a lot of inequities. And I think the problem there is they didn't actually ask racialized communities, people who were affected in those ways. So there was a bit of a blind eye to that. And it's something that everyone can be weak to if you don't have connections to local First Nations or low-income communities. You might continue to make those decisions and not recognize the problems that they're creating. So what can be done? Well, there's quite a lot of things, and I wanted to include them all. So first of all, just acknowledging that there is a problem and confronting it. I think that we should be developing, if we are proceeding with water quality trading, we should be developing those policies and other environmental policies with that environmental racism lens. Who does this affect? What are the impacts? Those types of things. We need to ensure and implement free, prior, and informed consent. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. There should be extending opportunities to low-income and racialized communities to participate in the program. Should, of course, be incorporating Indigenous knowledge. We want to, one of the suggestions I came across was to address or identify and address hotspots. So this means when you have a water quality training program, sometimes that can lead to certain places having just increases in pollution because of the way the market, it's more expensive to address that area perhaps. But if that's starting to happen, that often can mean it's more expensive because you could have what do you call it, like low-income housing in the area or something like that is making it easier to handle pollution in that area. And so it's simply identifying hotspots is one of the ways to maybe like, oh, this might be an area that could be impacting someone without our knowledge. Providing technical assistance and resources certainly for Indigenous communities to participate in these programs. And then I think always a good idea to collect and track good data on on water quality, of course, but on impacts and on indicators of environmental racism. So free, prior, and informed consent. I don't know if people have been hearing about this lately. It seems to come up from time and time again because it's not really being recognized. And quite simply, it's when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, we're talking that people aren't being coerced into making a decision, that they have an actual option and a choice, that it's happening early on. So prior to starting any activities, right in that pre-planning phase, and that there's information and transparency along the way. And for Indigenous people, that consent is from the rights holders' point of view. So really starting from peoples who are the ones who carry the rights to the land and treaties. And this is backed up by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is something, there's a bill in motion to implement UNDRIP, as it's called, and numerous articles here talk about the participation in conservation, maintaining the quality of water for spiritual purposes, for economic purposes, and for other uses like food and subsistence. And so there's obviously large things we can do as a society systemically, but what can you do as a person when it comes to environmental racism? Well, we should be, quite simply listening. I always think that's, listen in an active way to Indigenous peoples. If it's in your power to provide technical assistance to Indigenous peoples, creating space for these kinds of discussions, of course, but also to participate in decision-making. Seeking anti-racism training for you and your staff. Actively recruiting Indigenous people and people of color in decision-making roles, not just as staff or volunteers, of course, but on all levels of your organization. And of course, always evaluating who's benefiting from the actions you're taking and the kind of programs you run. Yeah, I wanted to just put a small plug-in for the Lake St. Martin Outlet Channel project. This is something that is coming to a head this year with a decision in front of the federal government, and I think it's something that a lot of First Nations have been paying attention to because its impacts are so strong. There's so many impacts to First Nations people and Métis people, but I haven't been seeing enough support and allyship and solidarity from non-Indigenous people in Manitoba, and I thought it should be put in front of you as something to go learn more about and get involved. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much. And that's a very good point you've made at the very end about the Lake St. Martin channel. I've been wondering a lot about that myself, but I have to admit I don't know very much about it. So thanks for the reminder. Okay, we'll move on now to Rhonda Bouts and Angela Coleman, who are sharing a presentation. Rhonda and Angela both work at the South Nation Conservation in Eastern Ontario. Rhonda has worked for South Nation Conservation for 25 years and is currently their team lead in special projects. She's delivered landowner stewardship programs for over 20 years, including their Clean Water program, a cost share grant program for watershed property owners. She'd helped to develop and delivers the South Nation River Total Phosphorus Management Water Quality Trading Program, the first program of its kind in Ontario. Rhonda has extensive stakeholder engagement experience working with and participating on several committees and working groups. And Angela summered, articled, and practiced with a large Ottawa firm and now works with South Nation Conservation Authority as General Manager, Secretary Treasurer. Over the past 20 years, Angela has worked in project management, community engagement, and law. She had been actively involved in drinking water projects, real property issues, and planning and development reviews. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you two now.
Thank you very much, Vicki, and good afternoon, everyone. I think Rhonda and I are going to go back and forth on this presentation through the different slides. And we have had the added benefit of doing this presentation a number of times, including for the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, as she was curious about the program and its outputs and outcomes. Next slide, please, Rhonda. If it works. We'll see. Perfect. So I think in the context of environmental programs, it's important to start at the beginning. So here, we're giving you the physical landscape of where we are. So located on the map, we have a fairly large physical jurisdiction of the watershed. Our area shows up in green. As you can see, the Great Lakes of Ontario are all showing up in blue and are fairly large, and we are a ways away from the main tributaries and Great Lakes of Ontario. So we're talking about, in our watershed, a smaller tributary that runs throughout the full course of the watershed. We have 16 member municipalities in that area and a population of about 200,000 people. The time that we are looking at in our watershed, we look at quite a significant acreage and agricultural land use. And with that, we can say, not super high levels of forest cover throughout the watershed. The area has been largely deforested, for a number of years. The watershed itself is fairly flat, so we don't have a lot of elevation in the tributary. So I give that context to say that the trading program that we have in Ontario here, and the program specific to our watershed and South Nation conservation, was formulated about 25 years ago. So we're sensitive to all of the topics of discussion today. And to say water quality credit trading, the first slide deck started, is it a blessing or a curse? I think it's probably something we wouldn't put such a polarized value on. I think what it is we will present the context to you of our program, and you can judge for yourself and see where over 25 years there may be changes we would make to such a program. But the context of the beginning of the program was 25 years ago. So most people know that over 25 years, whether it's in the context of decisions by the Supreme Court of Canada to all the way to today, a lot has changed in terms of our own understanding of environmental racism and other issues systematic to environmental programs and services that one would want to consider, I think, as they evaluated a program on a go-forward basis. So is our program a utopia? I would say not. But what it is what we will present as what we did in our watershed, and how over time, I think that we have changed the program and adapted the program to meet with the stakeholders and meet with the needs of a changing watershed over time. Next slide, please, Rhonda. We have significant phosphorus degradation in the watershed. So what that means is it's about 5 times the allowable provincial drinking quality standard for phosphorus. And we have different studies that substantiated this. And I think this is important to understand the context as well. About 90% of phosphorus is coming from, or was coming from at that time, non-point sources of pollution. So that is to say that there's a large phosphorus loading in that watershed coming from diffuse or non-point sources. And South Nation tributaries are considered under the Ontario framework as a policy 2 receiver. So that's under the provincial water quality objectives. And of course, each province and jurisdiction may have a different sort of objectives that they're trying to meet for water quality. Next slide, please. In terms of the regulating of phosphorus discharge, we are basically looking here, and you can see a different slide. The red star shows where we have a surface water intake, receiving surface water from the South Nation River as drinking water for a community. And I will say that the watershed, it doesn't have a lot of lakes, rivers, or other types of overland types of surface water. We rely primarily and quite often on groundwater, and that is groundwater from private drinking water sources, where an individual would have their own drinking water well, to municipal sources of drinking water, where the municipal drinking water would be coming from a groundwater well as well. The different areas to the left and the north and south, or the top and bottom of our watershed, that is the Ottawa River taking water out and the St. Lawrence River taking water out. And so those 2 drinking water surfaces are our larger surface water systems. And of course, many municipalities are as well relying on surface water coming from those drinking water systems. So one in the middle of the watershed, or sort of in that red star area, receiving surface water, and a lot of the other municipalities receiving their water from groundwater wells. But what you do see in the blue dots are that those same municipalities are, for the most part, having surface water. Some of it's municipalities and some of it is industrial and food production. But a lot of those blue dots represent some of the point source discharges within the watershed. And to say, I think we have to look back contextually and say this was 25 years ago. And I think at the time, though, there was a lot of thoughtful consideration. Now, this can't be brushed aside as just saying it's a simple economics argument. These are rural communities with not a lot of population. So their ability as a municipality to generate through taxes and other levies the required funds it would take to pay for significant updates to the treatment plants and the lagoons is not an economic consideration to be taken lightly. And of course, is an economic consideration that did consider the ability to pay of many rural families and different families in the watershed, which is why there was some discussion about alternatives to get the water quality standards for the lagoons and effluent to a better level, but perhaps without taking all of those treatment plants and lagoons to a higher level of treatment, simply because of consideration of what the economic cost would be to those rural residents and to those small communities, and whether or not they could afford it. And again, that's not to dismiss any of those types of discussions, but I think it did have a lens 25 years ago of rural community and ability to pay whenever we were looking at what would be the best outcome for the treatment requirements of lagoons and effluent going in from point sources within the receiver. Slide. And of course, there were many concerns that showed all their way into local media and other concerns of many. The concern, of course, being that came largely from the agricultural community in this context, and that was simply that municipalities would be able to put additional effluent into the watercourse, while farmers had to bear the brunt and bear the cost of what they perceived what would be expensive upgrades to farming practices within the watershed. So there was certainly a large number of people that had a number of concerns with respect to a program such as this, and the ways that it would potentially impact operations of different types of producers within the watershed. Rhonda, do you want to take this one?
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes just walking through sort of what our program looks like, how it was developed, and how it's still running today. We won't be able to touch on everything, but it actually is one of the 6 case studies in the report that Marina mentioned, so you can find probably additional information in there as well. So as Angela said, it was not necessarily an easy start to bring a water quality trading, which was a very new concept, into Eastern Ontario 20 years ago. So it quickly became evident that for this project to even come to fruition, that we needed to bring together the stakeholders around the table to really have meaningful dialogue and negotiations around how this program should operate within our watershed. So we did bring agricultural, provincial, municipal, and industrial representatives to the table to really have a discussion about who the players are, what role do they play, and what responsibilities would they have under this new trading framework. Another big point of contention was the farming community felt the original 2-to-1 offset was too low. So through negotiations, our program actually was finalized and operates at a 4-to-1 offset. So again, it's in regards to phosphorus. So if a discharger is discharging 1 kilogram of phosphorus, they must then remove 4 kilograms from non-point sources. So that was about a year-long discussion, and we all signed off, excuse me, on a roles and responsibilities document and officially started the program in the fall of 2000. As with many programs, it's an option, but not necessarily the best answer. So it really comes down to the discharger having to choose the method that they want to use in order to meet the zero phosphorus increase for newer expanding dischargers that comes from that policy to receiver that's designated by the province. So during the environmental assessments, each discharger can look at trading as an option. And in most cases, as Angela mentioned, with the costs, especially 20 years ago, to achieve the level of treatment needed to meet zero phosphorus, the trading option was, in pretty much every case with our municipalities, the way that they wish to go. And it should be noted too that once the phosphorus trading is chosen by the discharger, it actually is written into their environmental compliance approval, so their license to discharge, it's directly referenced in that document, and a requirement that they have to meet in order to stay in compliance with that license. Unlike many other trading programs, especially across the US, we are a closed market system, so there is no middle broker. South Nation is the broker, and only trades can occur through our office. So that sort of eliminates some of the confusion with dischargers and possible credit generators trying to navigate a complicated process. That's all done centrally through our authority. So basically, once a discharger chooses the credit trading option, we calculate what their contribution needs to be based on what their system design is for annual phosphorus output. We then basically invoice them that amount, and that funding goes into grants for best management practices. Again, keeping in mind that this works because our watershed is over 60% agriculture, so we do have capacity out on the landscape to do best management practices. And then a small portion of that funding is on the delivery side as well, for us to be able to actually get projects on the ground and grants out to landowners. Unlike some other projects, we only deal with capital-based projects, so our program does not recognize projects like buffer strips or nutrient management planning or reductions as part of our trading credit generators. So we're looking at long-term capital projects that we know will be in the landscape for a longer period of time. So manure storage is a milk house, wash water, wastewater storage, barnyard runoff controls, livestock fencing along water courses, and septic systems are the only project types that actually generate credits through our program that are eligible underneath total phosphorus management. We've said it a few times from other speakers, the more simple it is, the more success you're going to have in delivering a program like this. So the keep it simple approach is certainly one that we champion in this area. We focus the program, as we always have with our grant program, on getting grants to landowners to do best management practices. The farmer at the end really doesn't care too much that it's part of a trading program. What they want to know is whether or not they have the financial support through the cost share program. And really, the way our program's set up with us as the broker, they don't have to worry about doing any additional paperwork. They apply to the program. They indicate that they know that any credits that are generated are going into the program and held through the authority. And then they basically just have to do their project. They put their project in place, send in the paperwork that's required at the end, and we grant the grant check to them. We integrated it into our longstanding clean water program. So for us, it was we didn't have to worry about building a framework. The framework existed, which is one of the reasons why the province came to us as the delivery agent and why it's a closed market system. We were using a peer-to-peer approach before the trading program started, and it definitely was a benefit in this framework. So we actually have working and retired farmers that work for us on a part-time basis that do the site visits for us. So they're meeting with their peers out in the field to discuss projects and helping them through the application process. And I think having that peer-to-peer approach is very beneficial. I mentioned our clean water program. So we were operating in the early 90s. And again, keep in mind, the trading program started in about 2000. So we had almost a decade of success behind the program before it was actually utilized as the framework for trading. So to date, this is all projects, not just trading, but we've put about $2.6 million in grants to over 880 projects across the watershed. And we do have a multi-stakeholder committee that is reviewing and approving all projects. So it's not done at a staff level. It is done by a multi-stakeholder committee, of which there are 50% or more agricultural representation. As far as how do we calculate how much a project generates as far as phosphorus reduction, we do have a set of algorithms that were developed and updated and peer-reviewed in the early 2000s. These are peer-reviewed science-based calculations that the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, at the time called Ministry of the Environment, did acknowledge were an acceptable way to estimate reductions for phosphorus. They're conservative, and again, between the conservative calculations and the 4-to-1 offset, they were comfortable in using this mechanism in which to track how many credits are generated by each project that's implemented. And just a quick snapshot of the number of trades that have occurred since the program started in 2000. You'll see from the graph that most of the activity occurred in the early 2000s. That's a direct relation to all of our larger communities that were actually expanding their wastewater lagoons at that time. There was infrastructure funding available from the province, and the trading did qualify as funding for the municipalities. So again, that helped with the economic barriers that many of our small rural municipalities face. Over the last couple of years, you'll see that we've had a few occasional trades. It's certainly not a steady intake every year, and most of our recent credits have been more around smaller communal wastewater systems. So again, with most of our municipalities doing their major upgrades about 20 years ago, they're not again in their infrastructure horizon to do any major projects in the next little while, which is why you sort of see those gaps for trading years on the map. But the program is still operational, and any new or expanding discharger, when they apply for their certificate to operate, do need to meet the zero phosphorus increase, either by trading or through technology. So we've completed just under 300 projects that generated credits. You'll see that we are generating more credits than we actually need to meet agreements. So we do in effect have a bank, and about just under $1 million has flowed through the program since it started in 2000. I think I'll turn it back to Ange to sort of do a wrap up on where legislation sits today, because this was not the case when we started our program 20 years ago.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but couldn't you keep it very brief, because we're actually running overtime here. So
no,
thank
we'll
you.
just pass it on.
Okay. Oh, you'll pass?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thanks so much, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but that's really interesting, seeing a program that has actually been working. Our final speaker today is Tara Hineson, and Tara is Food and Water Watch's legal director and is based in Portland, Oregon. She joined Food and Water Watch as a staff attorney in 2015 and has since focused on issues related to factory farm pollution and water pollution trading. Before joining Food and Water Watch, Tara spent 5 years as an attorney at the Environmental Integrity Project, leading programs focused on enforcing laws that regulate factory farm water and air pollution and restoring the Chesapeake Bay. She graduated cum laude with a certificate in Environmental and Natural Resources Law from Lewis and Clark Law School in 2009. Prior to law school, she spent 2 years as a grassroots organizer for the Sierra Club in Iowa, working to reduce factory farm pollution. We could really use your help here in Manitoba, I have to say, Tara. But anyway, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks to the Manitoba Eco Network for reaching out to us and having us participate in this great event. For those unfamiliar with Food and Water Watch, which is, I'm guessing, most of you, we are a national organization that organizes people around the US to build political power and protect our food, water, and climate. We believe that people have the power to make real change, and we mobilize people to challenge corporate power at every level. And opposing pollution trading schemes is an important part of that work. And I do, as you'll notice, call it water pollution trading, not water quality trading, because really this is a system that shifts pollution from one place to another. And so I'm going to just discuss some of the lessons learned from how trading has been implemented in parts of the US, and hopefully some cautionary tales and things to watch out for as programs may be developed in your area. Some of this has been covered by Marina and others, but I'm just going to give a really brief overview of water pollution regulation. In the US, there are a lot of parallels, like the language point source and non-point source, so that's easy. But in a nutshell, we regulate water pollution at the federal level through our Federal Clean Water Act. It's implemented by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And the cornerstone of this law is a permit program that restricts discharges at the point source level based on the technology that exists for an industry sector, or if that's not enough to protect a waterway, stricter permit limits based on water quality needs. Similar to most places, the Clean Water Act does not regulate most agricultural or non-point source pollution. So I'll get into, of course, how that leads to some problems. And the Clean Water Act itself doesn't mention trading. It is fundamentally a system of regulating pollution at the discharger level. It is not a cap and trade program. So even though EPA sets the federal requirements for Clean Water Act administration, the actual permit program is administered almost exclusively by states. And that allows for some flexibility. States have to do as much as EPA requires, but they can go above and beyond. They can regulate things that the Clean Water Act does not regulate. So there is some variation across the country. Now, agricultural non-point source pollution, not regulated by the Clean Water Act, now is the largest source of pollution in the United States and is responsible, or at least contributes to, a lot of water pollution impairments across the country with nitrogen, phosphorus, harmful bacteria, and sediment. States, as I mentioned, can regulate agricultural pollution. Some do through requirements for nutrient management planning and other things like setbacks and buffer strips, but many generally do not, and instead rely primarily on voluntary best management practices, some of which are incentivized through federal and state programs. So as I think Marina mentioned, we deal with the resulting impaired waterways from this kind of incomplete regulatory approach through what are called Tmdls, when the technology and water quality based protections in these permits aren't enough to protect a waterway and all the uses that we want it to be maintained for. These are cleanup plans. They establish a pollution budget that is the most that we think a waterway can sustain of a given pollutant of concern and still meet water quality requirements. And that allocation is divided up among all the contributors of that pollutant, including the non-point sources, the farms. These Tmdls have not always resulted in the water quality improvements that we need either. And in the Chesapeake Bay region, this is a kind of a hallmark example of a huge cleanup plan, multi-state, and it's a place where a lot of innovation has been happening, including the development and expansion of water pollution trading programs to try to get at that non-point source part of the pollution that's making it so incredibly difficult and expensive to bring the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries back to the quality that we want it to achieve. So instead of taking a regulatory approach, this means that we are doubling down on the voluntary approach to get at that large source of pollution coming from non-point sources. And one of the big concerns that I have with the pollution trading programs is that it actually threatens to erode what has been so successful about our Clean Water Act, the permit program that has been very effective at reducing point source pollution over the past 50-some years. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. There's another concern that we've seen implemented kind of inconsistently. I mentioned these Tmdls. A given farm might have an allocation of nitrogen and phosphorus that it's supposed to achieve to bring a waterway into compliance, but not all trading programs require every source to achieve its load allocation before it is eligible to generate trading credits through additional practices. So this really relates to what we would call a baseline. So the baseline requirements for eligibility to trade are extremely important, making sure that you first achieve the necessary water quality objectives before you're allowing any trading that is really just going to be a zero-sum game. And so we do think that this threatens to slow progress towards water quality goals if implemented in a way that doesn't set strong baselines and hold point sources accountable. Because ultimately, as has been discussed, trading proponents emphasize the cost savings for point source polluters first and foremost, as opposed to an overall net reduction of water pollution. It's about reducing pollution the same amount for less money. And as I mentioned, there's no mention of trading in the US Clean Water Act. And what that has meant in practice is that EPA has not established any mandatory requirements for state trading programs. And it's not a complete free-for-all, but it has been inconsistent and has led to a patchwork because EPA has not set binding regulations that set a floor for what trading programs must require. And so at least in certain programs across the US, we've seen several things that point to a lack of the accountability and transparency that we would like to see in, well, we would not like to see these systems, but that people who are proponents of these programs, I think, would hopefully want to see. Folks have talked already about various agricultural practices that in some programs are allowed to generate credits. There's a serious concern about the certainty and effectiveness of different agricultural practices. There are, as has been discussed, sometimes trading ratios that are meant to account for some of this uncertainty. 4-to-1 is one of the stronger ratios I've seen. But there still is a dearth of information about the precise reductions we can expect in, say, pounds of nitrogen from a specific best management practice being implemented on one farm. There are studies that have taken place under very highly managed kind of lab conditions, and there are serious concerns that that doesn't necessarily translate into something universal that can be modeled and applied in every situation. Farm practices entail a tremendous number of variables. And in addition, we've seen some programs that allow practices that truly do just move pollution around in a way that threatens to actually increase net pollution. So for example, in Pennsylvania, the part of the Pennsylvania that is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed is part of the total maximum daily load for the bay, and there's a trading program in that area. Pennsylvania has certified and approved credits for simply moving poultry waste out of the watershed, where it's going to be land applied in very much the same way in a different watershed. We've even seen that take place where the receiving watershed was also impaired, but it's not part of the same trade. So ultimately, a point source polluter is purchasing these credits to avoid reducing their pollution, but the claimed reduction in pollution is really just moving to a different watershed. And without extremely rigorous verification, it's hard to be certain that that won't become widespread. And of course, verification and monitoring are also being implemented in very inconsistent ways. Some have third-party aggregators that broker and manage a marketplace. Clearly, some do not. But this is resource intensive. Often it is taking public resources to develop these labor-intensive systems. And it also risks creating an incentive by private third-party brokers to show that these programs are successful and to generate more trading. So there's a concern that that could lead to a risk of fraud. And as Daniel discussed, there's also a concern about pollution hotspots resulting in environmental justice communities where industrial sources choose to pay to continue polluting instead of reducing their pollution, and the communities nearby bear the consequences, as opposed to how we have done things for the last 50 years, where every facility has to meet its own pollution targets. So just to show a little bit about the hotspot concern, this is a Chesapeake Bay watershed map. In the middle, the green is Pennsylvania. This is the trading basin. The entire section of Pennsylvania that's in the relevant watershed is one trading basin. So this is a huge area, and maybe not on Canada's scale, but it's a pretty large area to allow for trading and could result in significantly disparate impacts if industrial polluters that choose to purchase credits are concentrated in one area. That could certainly lead to pollution hotspots. So looking at the scale of trading is very important. And we're also concerned about what this does to enforceability of the permits for point source polluters in the states. And this may differ significantly, but a really important part of the US Clean Water Act is that not only regulators, but citizens can take polluters to court to enforce their permits when they violate them by, for example, exceeding their annual nitrogen limit. In Pennsylvania, again, as an example, the state is allowing point sources to tally up their annual nitrogen and phosphorus at the end of the year. And if a facility, say, has a nitrogen limit of 1,000 pounds, and at the end of the year, it turns out they've discharged 2,000 pounds, that for the last 52 years has been a violation of the Clean Water Act. Now, that facility is allowed to go to the marketplace, buy 1,000 pounds of nitrogen after the fact, and claim that it has come into compliance. And that really turns our accountability scheme on its head and makes it virtually impossible, at least for citizens, to hold that polluter accountable, which also, of course, threatens to diminish the incentive to comply in the first place. And we're also concerned that this could create an incentive for facilities like factory farms that are under-regulated, those entities with the worst practices already in place without a strong baseline threaten to or stand to profit the most because they have the biggest gap between where they are and where they can be by implementing common sense practices that then could generate credits. So just to wrap up, a few things to reiterate to watch out for in a program are trading that would erode or walk back mandatory pollution controls that have proven successful, allowing those credit purchases after the fact when it really is just a substitute for requiring compliance with an established permit requirement, replacing what are really easily monitored and verified certain pollution reductions, for example, from wastewater treatment technology, with highly uncertain agricultural practices, and of course, trading across large geographic areas that threaten pollution hotspots where the credits generated to reduce pollution are generated far from where they're being actually used. Hopefully I bought us back a couple minutes. Thanks.
Okay, Tara, thank you very much. That's really interesting, and I hope that I can communicate with you individually. I'm involved in another group here in Manitoba that's very, very concerned about industrial agriculture. So, yes. Okay, I think that we're going to go to some questions now. So I'm going to just have a quick glance at the questions, and then we'll forward them to whoever the appropriate speaker is. First of all, someone has asked Marina, I'm interested in the spatial variations you mentioned as reflected in jurisdictional responsibilities. How might we leverage or dismantle so-called jurisdiction that reflects environmental value as monetization? Marina, can you make a comment about that?
Yes, I'll just kind of look at the question again. As I understand, this question refers to kind of how maybe define a watershed and the jurisdictions within those watersheds, and if we're designing a water quality trading program, how kind of regulations for within a certain jurisdiction affecting some of the polluters, how we're going to be kind of matched or reconciled with other polluters in the watershed. Is that kind of what the question is? Kind of how to harmonize the regulations to enable the water quality trading. So I'm sensing that's kind of the direction of the question. So I think there needs to be kind of a closer look at if you're considering pilot, there needs to be a closer look in the watershed to determine who are the polluters and how they're regulated, and whether the opportunities to purchase credits from somewhere else. It could be a voluntarily implemented best management practices. And with that in mind of who are the entities, there needs to be a closer look on what policies need to be designed to, formulate and enforce those limits. And also to avoid hotspots, there needs to be also consideration of where the, trading partners come from and spatially in the watershed. So it's something to be aware of. I'm not entirely sure I answered the question, but those are kind of my preliminary thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Marina. I appreciate that. Let's go to another question. Has anybody thought about how the proposed Manitoba nutrient regulations could enable water quality trading? Are they the right kind of regulations? What kind of additional regulations or policy might be needed? Does anybody, Marina, do you have a comment on that? I hate to put it back on you.
Yeah, sure. So for the proposed targets for Manitoba, so they would enable water quality trading in the way that if we have targets of for loads for rivers and lakes, then we'll be able to determine the emission limits for the point sources, for example. So as a kind of initial allocation, and this would be enabling water quality trading in that way, that we can formulate based on that the emission limits on loads for point sources.
Okay, does anyone else have a comment that you'd like to add to this?
I think Rhonda and I could say from our perspective in Ontario, and granted we don't have the federal framework that they have in the US, is the important thing in Ontario at least is that some type of regulatory permit be directly tied to the credit trading, because if it's not directly related to a specific activity, then it's sort of very esoteric to implement.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
I just have one quick little bit to add is, you know, the regulation, the nutrient targets there were, you know, for lakes and rivers, and but they didn't really provide a plan for how to get there. I think any water quality trading right now would have to rely on the current like license permit system that exists.
Okay, thanks. I'm actually going to kind of wrap together a couple of questions that I see that are in general the same, and that is, does this, and this should go to Angela and Rhonda to start with, do you have a sense of, was there actually an amount of phosphorus that has been reduced over the life of your water quality trading program? Or has it just been kept steady so that you're not seeing an increase in phosphorus? Because what I've seen from a few questions is people are wondering, will this actually help to decrease the phosphorus load?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I think that Rhonda will have the specifics on the actual uptake and decrease. Phosphorus isn't one that's very quickly though to see in the environment like a fast, like it's sometimes years, but Rhonda can comment on what we've seen specifically. But we can say that we are close to Ottawa and Montreal, so we are kind of under a lot of development pressure as well. So the one thing we do kind of look at it and say, well, we haven't seen increases, and we do count that as partly important in that calculation, but Rhonda can talk about it. It goes up and it goes down a little bit, but overall it's less. But I think the question, and what I'm really interested in hearing from the American perspective as well, I think it's sometimes we look at these programs and we say, well, is this the best way or is this not the best way? And I think we have to just, you know, keep in mind the is it credit trading that will cause the credit trading itself that's going to cause an increase, or if or can we do this all in a regulatory framework? Because there has to be a huge political appetite to go from zero regulation of a major industry to strict regulation. So I'm very interested in that, and Rhonda can talk about our phosphorus, but I'm so interested in our conversation and that as being the real question is, whether we agree with this or disagree with this, it happens in a larger context of regulation, and there has to be an appetite for the tight controls on point source, on point and non-point sources, frankly. So Rhonda, you can answer the P question, and I'm interested in the other answer.
Sure. So from what we calculated with our algorithms, it's just under 3,300 kilograms removed from the projects that we've implemented to date through the program. The challenge is we do water quality monitoring with a province, but we don't really have apples to compare. So we're talking about kilograms per phosphorus per year generated by the different projects. But what we measure is a milligram per liter amount against those water quality objectives. So we don't have an overall calculation for load coming into South Nation River and tributaries from non-point and point sources combined. So the only information we would have is whatever point sources are discharging and reporting and what we estimate. So I can't tell you how much is going in per year versus what we removed. We just don't have a comparable. What I can tell you is that we did see a slight decline in our phosphorus over a 20-year period, and we're sort of flatlined for now. So the other important thing that we didn't get a chance to touch on in our presentation is that we're a very flat clay-based watershed. So as we're removing point, non-point source phosphorus that's in a soluble form, we also have a lot of phosphorus in our clay soils. So that's another reason why we didn't expect to see this dramatic decrease on a graph, because we know that there's still a lot of natural phosphorus that will continue to leach out. The good news is the line in the graph is not going up. It's slightly decreased, sort of holding the line, and that's over the last 10 to 15 year period.
Okay, thank you. Tara, do you have anything you can add to this?
Sure. I mean, I think this also maybe ties into the question just put in the chat from Leanna. It's definitely a very difficult to tackle this huge source of essentially unregulated pollution, and the policy solutions are very difficult politically and practically. You know, from the US perspective, we even have sectors of agriculture that are supposed to be regulated as point sources and have really been left out of the regulatory scheme. So we can start with, you know, regulate our concentrated animal feeding operations as point sources. That would make a big difference. We also want to fundamentally change our food and agriculture system. Speaking of difficult policy solutions, but we have legislation that's been introduced in the US Senate and House to ban large CAFOs and fund a just transition for farmers to transition out of the industrial agriculture model and into more sustainable and ultimately more financially viable forms of agriculture. So that's the long-term vision that we're building for. We also don't oppose funding certain agricultural practices that will have water quality benefits. I think where we see the problem coming in is in the trading element of it, because it takes the accountability away from the point sources. So it's not that we don't want to provide flexibility for farmers. It's that that could be separate from a policy perspective from maintaining the requirements currently imposed on point sources. And of course, certain wastewater treatment facilities and public entities have serious financial difficulties funding expensive upgrades, but there are also, you know, funding mechanisms, federal, not just at the local level, that we should be exploring to make sure that we're funding water infrastructure to make sure that these upgrades can take place. So it's not politically easy, but I think there are alternatives.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Here's another question that I don't want to miss. Why is water quality trading only being presented as unidirectional? In other words, point source contributors paying for non-point source reductions. In Manitoba, we actually have much more technical knowledge about how to achieve phosphorus reductions from point source infrastructure than we do about achieving reductions from non-point sources, which are very poorly monitored. Can anybody comment on that?
Is that a question? Is it a question? Is that a question or statement?
Well, the first part of the question is, why is it only being presented as unidirectional? In other words, only, you know, from point source contributors paying for non-point source reductions. I think that's the question. Whether there's really any answer to that, I'm not sure.
There can be a short answer, I think, from us, and that's sort of like our program sort of operates as a basically a clean water program, if you will, that's funded by point source offsets. And like I said, that may not be the case on a go forward basis as technology improves. But 25 years ago, the cost benefit analysis was such that in a watershed with 90% point source or non-point source contribution, that made sense. That may not make sense today, and it may not make sense for every watershed. I think that's the answer, simply put.
I can add one additional point to just to put context again on the beginnings of our program. 20 years ago when we started, we did not have our Provincial Nutrient Management Act. We did not have our Provincial Clean Water Act for municipal drinking water. So there weren't really a lot of regulatory requirements on non-point sources back 20 years ago. So of course we've seen introduction of regulations over the last 15 years. But again, we were in a very different place when we started this program 20 years ago. So there was only the Ontario Water Resources Act that had any real regulatory requirements, and in many cases farming practices or normal farming practices were exempt at that time. So now we have specific Nutrient Management Act requirements and drinking water requirements under our Clean Water Act that didn't exist 20 years ago.
And the requirements are higher as well. So the regulatory requirement is higher on the tertiary treatment, et cetera. And I do think that's the best place for it. The higher the requirement from legislative perspective, the less need that there'll be to discuss alternative approaches. So I think that's what it is. So I think, yes, there's a lot more research, and the regulatory framework is going to require higher treatment at end of pipe than it would have 20 years ago.
Yeah, I just want to add on this question as well, is that water quality trading in our context could be considered kind of as one of the instruments, right? So if there's upgrades to wastewater treatment facilities take decades, in the meantime, water quality trading could be considered between point source and non-point sources. Also, while research on reductions from the non-point sources kind of is lacking, there's still efforts to understand how, for example, best management practices reduce nutrient runoff. And one of those programs is Living Labs, led by Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada and the partners in Manitoba as well. So this is something to keep in mind, and there are efforts that are going on to model how the best management practices reduce pollution from the land. So even though there's maybe lack of certain data, there's still work happening, and those efforts could contribute to some knowledge and expertise to developing those kind of water quality trading options with the non-point sources.
Okay, thank you. Here's something on a slightly different tack, and that is someone has asked Daniel, is there a way that you would recommend engaging with the Lake St. Martin outlet channel? This person said she had attended some earlier provincial consultation but felt not listened to at all. Is there a way you can recommend to get involved? And that's for Daniel.
I was on mute. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's the Lake St. Martin Channel, of course, has been was a proposed project by Manitoba Infrastructure, and has moved along to the impact assessment stages. And so Manitoba Infrastructure has they had a public consultation period, which is closed, and they are now responding to that. I think where support is needed is that a lot of those responses were from First Nations, Manitoba Métis Federation, tribal councils, as well as scientists and engineers who had serious challenges to the project. And the decision is going to be put in front of the Environment, Climate Change Canada Minister, John Wilkinson. And I believe that he needs to hear from people that those voices of Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, scientists need to be heard when it comes to this project, because we're talking about water quality trading in this market sense, but this is a plan to move water from one water sub-watershed to another. And we don't have the information to really understand it, and all the impacts that it will have, and seemingly no plan to deal with them. So I do think it's important to get involved. I think at this point that means writing a letter to Minister John Wilkinson with the federal government. They will be making that final decision, so sometime this year. So I encourage people to reach out sooner or later.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question for either Daniel or Tara. What policy or other alternatives, in your view, could replace water quality trading or water pollution trading?
I mean, I think Tara did mention a number of solutions they're working on. I think it's interesting to me from what I've been hearing. There doesn't seem to be really a thirst for accountability amongst the water quality trading. I thought that was compelling to not to think of how we don't talk about how much pollution is being reduced. More it's about the economics. So I think one place you need to start when you're thinking about the environment is what do we know about the water quality? So if we don't know how much phosphorus is coming from an area, a farm field, even a point source, we don't have good information to make good policy. Often when we're talking about Lake Winnipeg, people want to blame someone else. They always want to point a finger to something that isn't them usually, right? Rarely, I've never heard someone say, oh, well, I better get on it and start dealing with this Lake Winnipeg problem. It's usually someone else, like a farmer, the city, a cottager. But really, like we all live, obviously not everyone lives in this water, but if you're in this watershed or wherever you find yourself, you do have that responsibility, and you contribute, and we all contribute nutrients, of course. We're all part of either a municipal system or food system that also contributes, and we do have to make those decisions. So I think one of my main concerns around water quality trading was that it would be put in place of bad policies that aren't sufficiently regulating agriculture, for instance, or failing to get a permit for waste treatment, water waste treatment. Currently we have on the northern sewage treatment plant in Winnipeg still hasn't met its regulations, and with no plan to meet that. Or sorry, there is a plan. There's a plan to meet it in 12 years from this point. But that's we're looking at a 20 years past the point where there was regulations put in place. I think the regulator needs to really step up when it comes to that contribution of phosphorus. It's one of the largest in the watershed. We've had regulation on manure management that has been weakened over the last 10 years as well. Let's return back to that. I think there's some areas to go in, some that answers we already know, of course, as well. Sorry, I've went on too long.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Tara, did you have anything to add to this?
I don't think I have anything to add to what I said before, and agree with those points. They're really important.
Okay. I think we're actually at the end of our time. So I know that there's a couple of more unanswered questions, but perhaps I'm not sure what to say about that. Perhaps the questions could be answered directly by the speakers. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of the presenters, and thank you so much to everybody who has joined in. This is a really important discussion. I know that I've learned something from it, and we're all going to have to consider this, I think, as we carry on in this area, because cutting down on water pollution is going to be of absolute critical importance as we move on. And I noticed that somebody has just said, you can send your questions to info at check online on the chat. You can send them to info at the Manitoba Eco Network, and we'll make sure that they get answered. So again, thank you so much to everybody for being part of this today, and we'll say goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.